So today, relatively speaking, we don't have to go too far back because it was on this day in 2019 that we witnessed the most devastating weather event to ever strike the Bahamas. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. We're just about to look back to the day that Dorian became the massive and pulverizing Category 5 hurricane on September 1st, 2019, this day in weather history. It is considered to be the worst natural disaster in that country's history. It was most assuredly the most intense tropical cyclone on record to strike the Bahamas. Hurricane Dorian was an extremely powerful and devastating Category 5 Atlantic hurricane. It was also one of the most powerful hurricanes recorded in all of the Atlantic Ocean in the category of 1-minute sustained winds when these peaked at 185 miles per hour. That's almost 300 kilometer per hour winds. It was only 2 years prior to that the last most powerful hurricane on record in the open Atlantic Ocean occurred. That was Hurricane Irma of 2017. Now I say open Atlantic so as to intentionally not include the Caribbean Sea nor the Gulf of Mexico. Dorian in 2019 was the fourth named storm, second hurricane, first major hurricane, but the first Category 5 of the 2019 Atlantic hurricane season. Dorian's first strike made landfall in the Bahamas in Elbow Cay, just east of Abaco Island, on September 1st of 2019, this day in weather history, with those devastating wind gusts I mentioned earlier that actually tied with the 1935 Labor Day hurricane for the highest wind speeds of an Atlantic hurricane ever recorded at landfall. And, as fate may have it, that hurricane happened on September 2nd of that year, so we will cover its details tomorrow. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, and oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Then Dorian was quick to move on and strike Grand Bahamas, but unfortunately, it had not dropped any of its intensity. And to make matters infinitely worse, this behemoth of a storm stalled out just north of the territory and unleashed its unrelenting winds for the next 24 hours. Now, I remember vividly watching this all unfold while working afternoons at the Weather Network in Canada. Having been to many of these islands before and knowing their population density and topography, I can tell you this. It's like when you take an orange or a grapefruit half, you do that, and then you grind it over a handheld juicer, literally pulverizing it. No exaggeration, this storm was that bad. The resultant damage to these islands was understandably catastrophic. Most structures were flattened or completely swept out to sea, and at least 70,000 people were left homeless as a result. Weakened, but by no means finished, Dorian began moving northwestward on September 3rd, tracking parallel to the east coast of Florida. Dropping in strength again, the hurricane turned to the northeast on the 4th, and then on the 6th of September made landfall on Cape Hatteras as a now Category 2 storm. Still not done, it transitioned into an extratropical cyclone before knocking into first Nova Scotia and then Newfoundland with hurricane-force winds on September 8th. Finally, on September 10th, Dorian dissipated near Greenland, and the nightmare was finally over, and it hit its F5 zenith on September 1st, 2019, this day in weather history. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is September 2nd. In discussing on this podcast the details of hurricanes named Irma, Harvey, Katrina, and today's Dorian, one name keeps coming up: the 1935 Labor Day hurricane, right? Well, it was a September 2nd event, so we will dedicate tomorrow to its story. This day in weather history with me, your host, Chris May.